Tonight we welcome back Jane Oneail for another installment of her awesome series, her awesome art presentation series. Jane Oneail holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her organization is Culturally Curious, and Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. And tonight she brings us a very special program in commemoration of Black History Month. Martin Luther King Jr., it's called Bending Towards Justice, African Americans as Subject and Creators in American Art. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This program examines the arc as it relates to African American history enshrined in American art, from the colonial era portraits to the 19th century and Jim Crow era prints to 1960s civil rights photography. This program will provide a visual overview of African American oppression, struggle, and progress towards equality. Thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions for Jane, please direct those to the chat and we will ask them after the program. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Jane.
Thank you, Jess.
You all for your patience.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted that you're curious in the subject matter, and I am honored to be able to.
What happened? I don't know.
Everybody hear me okay? All right. So I'm honored to share this material with you. I've always been really interested and really passionate about African American history, and going back to my college days, I had the opportunity to work on the catalog for a touring exhibition of African American prints from the 1930s and 40s from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so at that sort of young age, I was just sort of steeped in a lot of history and just developed this kind of tremendous respect for the art makers and the history that they were sort of working with and against in many cases. So that's sort of the development of, or the sort of the genesis of this program. And we'll be talking about this image that I have up on the screen in just a moment, but I wanted to start off by looking at that quote for just a moment. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." I've always loved this quote, and I think it really speaks to how frustratingly slow some of the changes have been in the United States as it pertains to the struggle for equality. And we'll see that certainly in the images tonight, but we'll also see that there is sort of an optimistic trajectory. And so we see things heading in the right direction. This is a quote that I think is rooted in that optimism. And so I wanted to begin with that because some of the images that we'll be starting with are really challenging. And you know, I think without a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, they can be sort of despairing. So what we'll be looking at tonight are images of fine art, and we'll be looking at some images of material culture and then some images from the history of art sort of woven all together. And unfortunately, of course, just with the time that we have, we won't be able to cover the entire scope of African Americans in American art. So this is going to be broad brushstrokes, forgive the pun. So let me give you the lay of the land in terms of how we'll be spending the next hour together. I've broken this up into three main categories. And the first category is essentially the colonial America up through the Civil War. And our title is Subject and Subjugation, because for this section, we are going to be looking at images of African Americans by primarily white artists, almost entirely white artists. And so we'll be looking at sort of the nuanced nature sometimes, and sometimes the overtly racist nature of some of these images, and sort of taking them apart and understanding them a little bit better. Then as we turn into the 20th century, we'll be looking at African Americans as creators and sort of the expression and the idioms that they used, beginning with the Harlem Renaissance and then in the decades beyond. And then the section that I'm probably most excited about is responding to history. So essentially everything from, not everything, a lot from the civil rights movement on, particularly looking at African American artists who are responding to the whole history that we'll be considering today. So let's dive right in with subject and subjugation. So again, these are white artists who are making the conscious choice to include African Americans in their works of art. And so let's take a look at how that plays out, what it looks like, and what it means. So the first image that I have up here, it's always good to start anything about America with an image of George Washington. It just gets us rooted. So of course, we're looking at our founding father and his family, his wife Martha and her two grandchildren that they raised as their own. And the artist here is Edward Savage, and the painting is from 1796. So this is a monumental painting. The figures are roughly life-size, and it's in the collection of the National Gallery of Art. And so it's really considered a masterwork. And if we sort of take it apart, there's a lot here in terms of the attributes, the objects that they have that are meant to sort of reaffirm their status and power. Of course, George Washington is dressed as a general. He's got his sword and his general's hat. We've got the child here with calipers in his hand, and his hand rests on a globe. You'll notice that that globe doesn't have any countries on it. It's really more of a reference to rising global power. And then Martha Washington uses a closed fan to point to a map here. And the map is a map of Washington, D.C., a plan for Washington, D.C. And I think she's pointing roughly to either where the National Mall is going to be or the White House. So there's a lot here to indicate just how incredibly powerful this figure group is. And Edward Savage traveled back and forth between Philadelphia and New York City in order to sit with each of these figures and paint them from life, so to get exact likeness of them. Then he rolled up this giant painting and actually took it to London with him. And while he was in London, he decided that he needed to add something to this painting to give it the flair of a Virginian plantation owner. And that's when he decided to include a Black figure standing on the right. And you can see from the image on the right here that this X-ray shows that the original figure was a young boy whose eye was just above where the fold of the lapel here is now. And so we know that he found a model while he was in London, painted the boy in, and then brought the picture back. And then, of course, he repainted it to include the figure that we see there now. And by all accounts, this is most likely George Washington's slave, William Lee, who was also known as Billy Lee. And it's very interesting because the research, the art history, and the museums that have written about this work over the years have really glossed over this figure. Sometimes just not acknowledging the fact that he's there, oftentimes calling him a servant when of course he was enslaved, and then almost always not naming him. So everybody else here is identifiable and important, and then there's a Black figure on the right. So he is almost certainly George Washington's personal valet who was enslaved, and we can make this deduction based on the fact that George Washington and Billy Lee were connected for 20 years or so, and by all accounts, Billy Lee was as impressive physically as George Washington was. They would sort of ride into battle, they would go fox hunting together, and so he had this kind of physical presence that George Washington was known to have. And so it would make sense that when Edward Savage came back to America with this painting, that he would paint over the sort of generic boy who didn't have a connection to Mount Vernon, and then paint in a specific figure. So the addition of William Lee to this picture actually falls into art historical traditions going back centuries and going back to Europe. So here's just a few images to give you a sense that in the history of European art and in American art, it was not uncommon for white portrait subjects to have an African figure included in the portrait with them in order to enhance their status and enhance their power. So you can see in both of these paintings, which date to the 1600s and the 1700s, that these figures are included on the edge of the picture in essence as another accessory, something else to add status and stature to the primary white figure in each of these pictures. So we can sort of deduce that that was why William Lee was included in this work of art as well. He's not really given his own space. In many ways, his clothing sort of helps him blend in with the background here, but he was included nonetheless, and it's important to recognize that and to talk about who he was. The next image that I want to show you from early America is considered a masterwork, and this is by the artist John Singleton Copley. And being close to Boston, I'm sure many of you have probably seen this work in real life at some point. This is in the Museum of Fine Arts. There's also a copy at the National Gallery of Art and at the Detroit Institute of Art. It was painted in 1778. And this, it's a stunning work of art. And again, this is on a monumental scale. And the picture is called Watson and the Shark. So it's about this picture, this boy who had gone swimming in a harbor and was attacked by a shark. And the shark actually ripped off his leg below the knee. And the boy was ultimately saved by these men in a boat. And this boy, Brooke Watson, grows up to be a very successful merchant in London, and then he joins Parliament, and then he becomes the Lord Mayor of London. And so in the second act of the artist John Singleton Copley's career, he moves to London and he connects with Brooke Watson. And I think he becomes sort of enamored by this heroic tale that has like these religious overtones of salvation. So he decides to paint it, and he creates this incredible picture, this incredible composition. And I want to draw your attention to, of course, the figure of African descent who's on this boat. So let me, if you can tear your eyes away from the shark, right? The shark is fantastic. So let's zoom in on this figure just for a moment. And I'll preface this by saying that generally speaking, in this era of American art, there aren't a lot of white artists who were consciously depicting, including figures of African descent in their pictures. And if they were oftentimes leaning on negative stereotypes, on racist stereotypes, and very clearly showing the power structure that existed in society at the time. And John Singleton Copley's painting doesn't seem to do that. I would say that if anything, the Black figure in this boat is rendered more sensitively and more individualistically than the other figures in the boat. And his face expresses, this incredible compassion and concern for what is happening here. And most importantly, unlike that George Washington picture we just saw, this figure is in the very center of the picture. He is not marginalized at all. He's not on the edge. He's not an afterthought. And in fact, we know that that John Singleton Copley had sort of an important role in mind for this figure, because if you look carefully, he is holding this rope in his hand that directly connects him to Brooke Watson and Brooke Watson's salvation. He is sort of the undiscovered hero in this picture. And John Singleton Copley, interestingly enough, did not originally conceive of this figure as being a Black figure. You can see in the sketch over here on the right that this figure has sort of like flowing hair, similar to the figure on the right over here. So he's made a conscious choice to make this a Black figure. And there's there's been a lot written in recent decades, really, about why he would have made this choice and what it really means. The fact that this is a picture of people on a boat with sharks included is really important, because the current sort of scholarship on this particular work of art is that for John Copley and any John Singleton Copley and any other viewer of this work of art, the association of Black bodies and boats at this time would have had a very strong association with slave ships. So of course, I have the image on the right over here is a plan for a regulated slave ship. And this was an image that was widely circulated in London, where John Singleton Copley was living. This was circulated a few years after this picture was painted, but it gives you a sense in terms of how these images were a part of culture. And of course, this image was circulated to support the cause of abolition, because as we look at this image, we begin to sort of wrap our brains around just how horrific the transportation of human beings was from Africa to the New World. It's to say it's inhumane conditions is such an understatement. So we have this association of Black people in boats. And what's more, there's a further association with Black people and sharks, unfortunately. And we can see that play out in a later painting by a British artist named J.M.W. Turner. And this is also at the Museum of Fine Arts. This is like one of the real treasures of the MFA's collection. And it's worth seeing in person when you get the chance, because this is a depiction of a slave ship that is heading into a typhoon. And in order to receive money, insurance money for the dead and dying slaves on the ship, they threw them overboard in the middle of the Atlantic. So as we zoom in here, you can see hands and feet still thrashing about, struggling to stay alive, and they're still chained. And as this is all happening, as the ship is heading into this terrifying storm, we also see these horrific fish and something like sharks sort of coming in for a feeding frenzy here. So it wasn't unusual for slave ships to lose 10, 15% of their human cargo as they're traveling from Africa to the New World. And it wasn't unusual for those bodies to end up in the Atlantic as shark food. So John Singleton Copley is creating this triangle, this relationship between shark and Black figure, and then Brooke Watson here, who, believe it or not, was actually against the abolition of slavery, and that was part of his political identity in London. So there's some thinking that perhaps John Singleton Copley created this figure as a Black figure to sort of create this sense of salvation for Brooke Watson on a spiritual level, in terms of saving him from what he had done in later on in his life. But in any event, it's an incredible picture, and it's an unusual picture for the time. So what we're going to do now is head into the 1800s and move to dry land. And I'm going to show you sort of the one work here that I would not consider to be a masterwork of American art at all. But I think this helps us sort of grasp the realities and the brutalities of the slave system in America. So what we're looking at here is a really unusual work of art. On the left, you can see one side is a really sort of generic, sort of nothing special about it, portrait of a white man, an upper class white man. And then on the back of this same picture, rotated to the side, we have this secret painting that would have been against the wall for 99% of the time. And it shows us two instances of physical abuse against Black bodies, sexual abuse against a Black woman, and physical corporal punishment against a Black man. And there's this kind of sickening title here, Virginian Luxuries. And then knowing that it was on the back of a picture, that it's something that would have been taken off the wall and sort of shared with the right audience, and sort of, I can imagine, sort of laughed about or delighted or shared with some sort of sense of delight or secrecy there. There's a really sort of sickening element to this picture. I'll mention that it's unsigned, it's undated, and it's in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. So researchers have pinned it to somewhere around 1815, 1825. But since the images that we're looking at tonight don't really cover the brutalities of the slave system, not in any sort of real sense, I thought that this was a good image to bring in, and it also sort of showcases that those realities are hidden so much in the art world. And so many of the rest of the images that we'll see by white artists are sort of layers upon layers of nuance, and we'll sort of dig into that. The next artist I wanted to show you creates these incredible, beautiful genre paintings. And genre paintings are scenes of everyday life. The artist here is William Sidney Mount, and the painting is called Farmer's Nooning from 1836. William Sidney Mount was working in Long Island, New York, and where slavery had already been abolished. And he created a number of these beautiful paintings that show sort of integrated life in New York State. And it's interesting to me that he chose to show Black people oftentimes in his artwork, but he himself was against the abolition of slavery. So that right there adds sort of an interesting layer in terms of understanding his works of art. So this can be seen as almost a meditation on the morality of work, because what we're looking at, of course, I think your eye goes directly to this incredible Black figure who is sort of luxuriating in the midday sun. He's taking a cat nap on the hay here, and he's sort of stretched out. He's again sort of individualized. The artist is not relying on racist stereotypes here, and our eye goes right to him because he's in the light. And then in the foreground you have three white farmers who are in the shade. And when I say that this is a meditation on the morality of work, you'll notice that this farmer over here on the left, even though he's resting, he's still sharpening his tools. And you can compare that to the fact that this Black man is just completely asleep. And I think in this case, William Sidney Mount may be relying on the history of art in order to sort of inform the understanding of his Black figure. So I bring in this very famous sculpture from the 3rd century BC. This is a Hellenistic Greek sculpture that's known as the Barberini Faun. It's incredible. What we're looking at here is a sleeping satyr. This arm position here is like the universal art historian or art historical pose for sleeping, not dead. So we see this sleeping satyr, and we are supposed to understand this as drunken, sort of troubled sleep, and that this is also a very sort of charged, erotic sculpture. You know, it's a nude man with his legs splayed open. So everything about it, the eroticism, the drunkenness, the sleeping, it is the furthest thing from rational conscious thought that you can get. And I would argue that William Sidney Mount is sort of basing his figure on that sleeping satyr over here. So we have the morality of work over here, and then this connection to the unconscious and eroticism over here. And then to sort of add insult to injury, the injury being this kind of nuanced dig here, that we have a white child who's sort of teasing him, taunting him by tickling him with a piece of straw on his ear while he sleeps. And this joke of the child sort of taunting the adult Black man is continued on by kind of lesser artists over the years. So about 15 years later, you have the artist James Cloney with a picture called Waking Up. And you can see it's the exact same setup. Another white child, another piece of straw, another sleeping Black man, and another connection again here to eroticism, because we even have oysters here, which are known to be kind of an aphrodisiac. So this is kind of a visual code for kind of understanding and reinforcing a social hierarchy. Now, the artist here, William Sidney Mount, I would say not all of his paintings have that same kind of nuanced understanding to them. So we go back to that title slide image called The Power of Music from 1847. This picture kind of takes my breath away. I think it's just beautifully painted, and I don't think that it's really a white artist kind of trying to take a dig. He's definitely showing us a kind of the difference, the socioeconomic difference in the reality of the lives of Black people versus white people in mid 19th century America. We see a Black man whose works whose clothes are just a patchwork of material. And we see, well-dressed white figures inside this barn. And sort of the structure of the painting and the structure of the barn itself is reinforcing just how separate their lives are. But William Sidney Mount is giving us this moment where there is a connection, and it's an invisible connection in this picture where they're all listening to and they're all moved by this music. And he sort of suggests that it's like a heavenly, almost otherworldly experience with this light shining down on this Black figure here. And I'll sort of zoom in here just so you can see how beautifully painted this is. He looks like he's sort of transported by this music. And so it's really just kind of delightful to look at. Oh, and I also just love this kind of visual element here of the barn door being this horizontal line that draws us right over to that fiddle player and makes it very clear what this Black man is paused to reflect upon. So in this case, I would say not necessarily a picture that's loaded with negative nuance here, but really more or less honestly showing the segregation that existed in America at this time, even in states where slavery had been abolished. So our next artist is another genre painter, and we're getting a little bit closer to the Civil War here. And this artist, another white artist, is named Eastman Johnson. And what we're looking at here is a painting called Negro Life in the South from 1859. And this is a fascinating painting because over the years, art historians have come a full 180 degrees in terms of how they interpret this work of art. We know that it's a depiction of Washington, D.C. neighborhood. And so the Black people who are depicted in this picture are in fact slaves. And the original interpretation that held up for many years is that this is a depiction of essentially happy slaves. Life is good, everything's fine. We see people who are flirting over here. We see a man making music. We see a woman who's dancing with a child. We even see a white woman who's entering their space from this kind of lush, flowery garden over here. So we can assume that that this nicer structure in the background is probably kind of like a master's quarters. And it seems as though that there's at least a sense of harmony between this white woman and these Black figures here. So that was the original interpretation. These days, it's the exact opposite. That Eastman Johnson is making a really pointed criticism on the system of slavery with this work of art, and in particular, he's pointing to sexual abuse that happened between slave owners and slaves, and he does this by showing us Black people with a variety of skin tones. And in particular, if you look up here in the window, there's a Black woman and her child, you'll notice, has very, very light skin. So perhaps Eastman Johnson was trying to point out those relationships. And art historians point to this ladder that connects the upper stories of these two structures, the slave's home and the master's home. And then I think the detail that really sort of seals the deal for me is the fact that he included a rooster way up here in the tree, sort of connected to the master's quarters, and a hen down here on this kind of dilapidated porch cover over here. So we have this association with certainly with the nighttime habits and the sexual habits that existed between that were established by slave owners in this case. So I think it's probably fair to say that Eastman Johnson was approaching this with more of a critical eye than had previously been believed. And I think this next painting by him, which always takes my breath away, is kind of further evidence of his point of view. What we're looking at here is called A Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves from 1862. And this is in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It's such a stunning, stunning picture. And the story behind it is that essentially slaves could win their freedom if they crossed the Civil War battlefields and made it to the Union side still alive, essentially. So this is a pre-dawn run, a pre-dawn flight, a pre-dawn race for freedom and liberty and their very lives. And we have a family of 4 on the back of this horse, a young child, a father, a woman with a baby at her breast. And she looks back at where they're coming from, and they're sort of pointed forward. And we can see just past the horse here, these little slivers of white are in fact the Union bayonets. So they are close. They're almost there. We don't know how it ends, but we're hopeful for them. And what's really incredible about this work of art, I mean, not only does it make you incredibly sympathetic to their plight and how dangerous and how desperate they must have been to do something like this. But this is a world away from the typical depiction of a runaway slave that existed in the material culture of the 19th century. So I just bring in a few of these runaway slave ads, which were essentially always built the same way. They had like a little shorthand running figure and then a very thin description of a slave that in no way encapsulates who they were as a person, or even none of them really functioned as great descriptions in general. I mean, you can see here like a description that says shows his teeth very much when he laughs. I mean, they're almost comical in that they don't really define a human being at all. And so you go from something like that to something like this, and you can see that Eastman Johnson had a particular perspective and sympathy, I would say, for slaves that were running for their lives. So as we round out the 19th century and the Civil War, there's just a few other objects that I wanted to bring in. And this work here is an important work by a white artist named Thomas Ball, who's from Boston. And the work is known as the Emancipation Group, but it's called the Freedmen's Memorial because it was the funds raised to create this monument were raised from freed slaves. And you probably have a similar feeling to the one that I have whenever I look at this, that it's sort of a strange image, and it's problematic. I'll just give you a couple other views of it too here. And so we see a fully clothed, standing Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, with his hand kind of hovering above a crouching Black man who is almost entirely nude. And we see that he's still chained. He still has shackles around his wrists. So it looks like he's about to rise, but it looks like that is, of course, very connected to Abraham Lincoln's gesture here. And when this sculpture was first unveiled in 1876, even Frederick Douglass was really uncomfortable with it. And he wrote, "The Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro not couchant on his knees like a 4-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." Now, in all likelihood, the artist here was probably thinking of one of the oldest and most powerful images associated with the abolitionist movement that goes back almost 100 years. And this image was created by the artist Josiah Wedgwood. And here, of course, we see a essentially naked, kneeling Black man in chains. He's called the supplicant slave. He's begging. And we have this text down here, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And the text combined with the image of the pleading, the begging, is fully intended to move our hearts and change our minds and change the circumstances for enslaved Africans. And so I think in this case, Thomas Ball was sort of borrowing from that, but the end result, I think, is somewhat unsettling, unsatisfying. And so there was a copy of this sculpture in Boston up until 2020. And at the end of last year, they took it down in the midst of all of these conversations about our national monuments and what we want to say about ourselves. And so there were a number of groups in Boston that essentially said, without any sort of context, I think this is a really problematic image to have on view in public. So they're looking for a new home for it still, I believe. So one of the last few images that I'm showing you from the 19th century is this one by Winslow Homer, and it's called Visit from the Old Mistress. This is also from 1876, and it's in the collection of the Smithsonian. This is such an incredible picture because this is, it's almost like a picture about the exchange of glances. The power dynamic between these figures has dramatically changed. This is post-slavery. And so we see these Black women engaging with this white woman in a very different way than they had presumably when they were essentially her chattel property. So I love sort of the differences in terms of their approach to her, but essentially what Winslow Homer is depicting here is that America doesn't really know how to proceed forward. What is what's going to happen next in this picture, and what's going to happen next for the country? He doesn't resolve that for us in this picture, and of course, it isn't resolved immediately, and there isn't an easy answer to this, but he captures it so perfectly here. So as we head into the 20th century, the last image I wanted to show you from this section is by a Black artist, Henry Tanner, and he's really considered America's first Black celebrity painter. And this particular image, the Banjo Lesson from 1893, is considered a real masterwork because for the first time, we see an African American who's sort of looking back at the racist imagery associated with African Americans and banjos, slaves and banjos, Black minstrels and banjos, and turning that imagery around, turning it on its head. And instead of saying, oh, yes, there's sort of a natural ability, a propensity to play musical instruments, particularly the banjo, instead we see it as this kind of sensitive lesson that's passed on from one generation to the next. And of course, he's not showing these figures with any sort of coded negative racial stereotypes. They are fully rendered human beings, sympathetically rendered, and so it's exciting to see how things can shift when we see African Americans depicting their own lives. And this is what we begin to see in the 20th century. So as African Americans sort of gain the financial stability and move away from southern plantations, we see this kind of creative explosion happening in cities all over the country. And there's a movement that's called the Harlem Renaissance movement that's primarily about literature, but it also includes the visual arts and dance. And so by the 1920s, when the Harlem Renaissance is essentially just exploding, you have a generation of artists that are coming of age and able to finally portray Black life and the vitality of Black life through the lens of their own experience and their own eyes, as opposed to being interpreted by white artists over the past century plus. So we're looking at two images by the artist Archibald Motley. And the image on the left is a depiction of his grandmother mending socks from 1924. And 5 years later, this is the blues. I love this painting of his grandmother. This just feels so much like a grandmother. Her face is depicted so realistically, and you can see the sort of respect and and admiration and love that he has for her sort of imbued in this. And interestingly, this image of his grandmother in this sort of lovely still life behind her, she has a framed portrait of a white lady. And that woman was actually a slave owner who owned his grandmother 60 years earlier. So 5 years later, Archibald Motley's work has sort of loosened up. It isn't that same sort of heightened sense of realism that we see with his grandmother. And instead, he's sort of leaning into abstraction. And this picture, the blues, he actually painted while he was in Paris because their segregation laws were a lot looser at that time. He was there on a Guggenheim Fellowship. And we can see this great nightclub scene where people are drinking and dancing. This is like, looking at this in the age of COVID, it just makes you want to go out so desperately. But I love how compressed the scene is, it just makes you look like a place that's loud and fun and boisterous, and you want to be there. So in the decades following, you have a number of African-American artists who rely really heavily on abstraction to tell the story of African-American experience. So this is an artist that I love so much, William H. Johnson. And these are two images from his Jitterbug series from the early 1940s. And these are both in the Smithsonian. These are great pictures of, people dancing the jitterbug. And so we see these dramatic poses. We see references to musical instruments. We see great pattern, great color. But most importantly, these are almost, they're dramatically abstracted pictures. And so we can see that this becomes a really, really popular way to depict African-American life in the decades following the Harlem Renaissance. William H. Johnson had lived abroad for many years. And so when he came back to the US, he was really dismayed at the lack of visual storytelling related to African-American history. So he painted this depiction of Harriet Tubman in 1945. It's such a striking work, and I believe it's also in the collection of the Smithsonian. So we see a full-length figure of Harriet Tubman dressed in clothes that I think with colors that we would associate with the flag. She's carrying the rifle, which she was known to carry as she helped people journey on the Underground Railroad to escape freedom. And then we see a portrait-length bust of her from later on in her life. So in the history of American art, it's really unusual to see any sort of heroic depiction of a woman, let alone a Black woman. And this is just such a striking portrayal. I think the background here sort of speaks to perhaps the two different worlds that existed, where slavery existed and where it didn't. So another artist that I wanted to show you who also used abstraction to great effect is the artist Aaron Douglas. And this work is from a little bit earlier. This is from 1934. And this is called Aspects of Negro Life from Slavery to Reconstruction. And this is part of a big mural series that's at the 135th Street, New York Public Library. So in the series of murals, essentially what he does is tell the story of this history using these silhouetted figures, these abstracted figures. Oftentimes they've got big shoulders, and we see the faces in profile with little slits for eyes. And this is a visual language that he sort of borrowed from West African art and kind of mixed in with European modernism. So we see a figure that maybe looks like he's leading prayer. We see figures over here with their hands in the air in praise. We see figures picking cotton, and we even see figures from the Ku Klux Klan riding in and beating figures down to the ground. And all of it is sort of enlivened with these concentric circles that kind of fragment and break up and amplify the storytelling here. So there's a lot going on in this picture, but just to keep us moving, the last artist that I wanted to show you from this time period is Jacob Lawrence. And this is the first painting from his Migration series from 1941. And so this is another artist that is using abstraction to his advantage, because the migration series is all about African Americans leaving southern plantations and heading to these cities. And of course, he's not showing us specific people. He is creating a universal history for all African Americans to feel connected to. And with an image like this, you can see, he's a master colorist. The way he uses like the peaches and yellows here, it just moves your eye around really in a really expert way. And so the whole series is just incredible. It's like a 60 painting series. But since we're connected with the Chelmsford Public Library tonight, I wanted to show you his painting of a library. And he painted libraries a lot in his career because he really valued them as a place to go and learn about African American history. I mean, there was really nothing for no resources other than the library for people to access this history that existed, this untapped history. So this is a 1967 image called The Library, and we can see dozens of figures in this case. We even have like a classroom with these little tiny kids in the background of dozens of African American figures accessing the library, showing like the full vitality of this New York City library, where there's research happening, perhaps debate happening, lessons happening. And again, the use of color, the composition here is just so wonderful. So we're going to head into this last section. And this last section is, again, sort of all African American artists, and it's artists who are responding to this history that I've tried to kind of encapsulate for you tonight. And I think that this is a really sort of exciting section to look at, because it's a little bit of art history, it's a little bit of social justice, and it's all kind of married together. So the first artist I wanted to share with you is Ernest Withers, who was an African-American photojournalist. And this is his 1968 photo from the Memphis sanitation workers strike. And this image is in my head so often, and it's so incredibly powerful. We see a line of African-American men, and we can see that there's sort of a sea of people behind them, because we see the sea of placards over their heads, and they all carry the same sign that says, "I am a man." And just saying that out loud, it sort of rips your heart out, because it's an argument that nobody should ever have to make. Nobody should ever have to argue for their own humanity. And we see all of these men who look like entirely respectable, decent human beings who should not have to argue for their own humanity. And I bring back that image of the supplicant slave because the language in particular is so resonant. Am I not a man and a brother? And so we've come a long way from the kneeling nude slave here to the modern day man who is very much a part of the fabric of American life, and is still making this argument. And of course, the Memphis sanitation worker strike is the same strike that brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis, which ultimately led to his assassination at the Lorraine Motel. So this would have been right at that time. So the next artist I wanted to show you, sort of moving up in time sort of quickly, is the artist Glenn Lygan. And you can probably see where I'm going to go with this one. This is from his 1993 series, Runaways. And essentially what he's doing with an image like this is referring back to those runaway slave ads from the 19th century, and pointing to the fact that the visuals and the text rarely gave you a full sense of who that Black person was who was trying to escape to their liberty. So Glenn Lygan in this case uses a description of himself to kind of point out the lunacy of those thin descriptions that existed in those runaway slave ads. One other Glenn Lygan image that I wanted to share with you that's sort of near and dear to my heart, because this is an image in my hometown museum, and it's called Invisible Man. So this is here in Manchester, New Hampshire, at the Currier Museum of Art, and it's from 1991. So it's two panels, and both panels have the first paragraph or so of the 1957 Ralph Ellison book, Invisible Man, which is about a lot of things, but these paragraphs, I think, sort of speak to the modern American Black man's sense of walking down the street and feeling invisible. And as we read that text, you can see that the letters themselves sort of get muddy. They sort of begin to bleed. They become unreadable, really. And then as you kind of zoom out and do that magic eye thing with your eyes, you can see that where he has muddied those letters, we essentially see the outline of a figure. And then over here, another figure in profile. So these two images sort of function almost like a mugshot. Um, and so we have the sense of a Black man feeling and being invisible, and then that association with a Black man being associated with being criminal. He did, the artist did another series where he actually used the mugshots of the men who were accused of being the Central Park Five, the now exonerated men, and he used their likenesses in images like this here. So he's making a really powerful statement about what it feels like to be a Black man in America. And he's doing that with in a really smart way with text and imagery. The next artist we're going to look at is also kind of pointing to that same feeling of invisibility with his work. The artist is Fred Wilson, and this installation is called Guarded View. And so we see 4 headless Black mannequins, and each of them is wearing an actual guard's uniform from a major New York City museum. Fred Wilson served as a museum guard when he was in college. And so he had that very particular and unusual feeling of having this important job, keeping the artwork safe, but being, essentially a part of a segregated staff. At most art museums, the most diverse staff is the security staff, and they are completely segregated away from the rest of the professional staff. And add to that this idea that they are in the galleries. They are who we as museum goers see when we're in the galleries, and they're so often ignored. Their bodies are on display as much as the works of art themselves are, and yet they are overlooked. About a year or so ago, I pulled this image on the right off of Twitter because you could see somebody was at the Whitney and essentially felt like the guard in the gallery was completing the installation in this case. So the last artist that I wanted to show you that sort of speaks to this idea of invisibility is Lorna Simpson, who created this work also in 1991. And this is called 5-Day Forecast. It's so similar to Fred Wilson. Because again, we have headless Black bodies here. In this case, 5 photographs, all slightly different. You can see that there's just minor shifts in the folds of the fabric of the dress that she's wearing. And where her head would be are the days of the week, Monday through Friday. And then the text down below is the words misdescription, misinformation, misidentify, misdiagnose, misfunction, mistranscribe, misremember, misgauge, misconstrue, and mistranslate. So part of this is kind of playing on the word miss, like when you're talking to a young woman, calling her miss. And then the other part of that is pointing to a fundamental lack of understanding and miscommunication that that is a part of her life, and I think by extension, many Black people's lives. And so her 5-day forecast is knowing that she is going to be confronted with these feelings, with these realities. And so you have this kind of guarded posture as she heads into this space where essentially she's an anonymous Black body that has to deal with those realities. So one other female artist that I wanted to share with you is Kara Walker, who is a MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner. And I think out of all the artists that we look at tonight, her images are really kind of the hardest to look at, but they're important to look at. This is Slaughter of the Innocents from 2016. And it's essentially a work of art that she began to develop in the early 1990s. And she's known for these huge installations of these black silhouette cutouts. And just to give you a sense of the scale of these kinds of work, this is a different installation, but they go on for 50, 75 feet. And they use the visual language of the kind of racist stereotypes that were a part of material culture in the 19th century. And they tell the story of African American life prior to the Civil War. They're hard to look at because they show violence. In this case, because of the religious subject, slaughter of the innocents, we have this association with, the sexual abuse of slaves, the loss of pregnancies, the loss of children here. And of course, she's using these black silhouette cutouts, which on the one hand, it's perfect. It's black figures. And then on the other hand, it's sort of kind of inverting our expectations here, because those silhouette cutouts were kind of a genteel way of creating a portrait at the time. So so she tells this really important history, and she does it in a really tough visual language. Now, the last two artists that we're going to look at use a lot of color, and they're really interested in the history of art. So the image on the right is by an artist named Kehinde Wiley, and he is really interested in depicting contemporary, living, everyday African American men and women. And I would say, sort of earlier on in his career, he was particularly interested in creating these kind of heroic portraits of contemporary African American men, showing them in ways that that we have traditionally associated with heroism. So in this case, obviously, he's borrowing the vocabulary of Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon from 1800, putting his figure on horseback, the horse is rearing up, the wind is flowing, and the figure is gesturing and looking right out at us. And what makes this so brilliant, of course, is, this connection back to the history, but then also just it prompts us to reflect upon the fact that we don't often see contemporary African American men depicted this way. And of course, he looks like somebody that you could see any day of the week, and he's appropriately wearing camo because this is a military subject matter. But he's put in the circumstance that sort of reminds us of his socioeconomic status as it relates to living in America, because we wouldn't expect to see a man that looks like this in a heroic painting per se. And this is a heroic painting. We can see the scale here is really impressive. This is in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It used to be in their lobby, and you would go through the little rat maze to buy your ticket. And the last time I was there, I just couldn't take my eyes off of this picture. Now, Wiley also did Barack Obama's official presidential portrait, and there's a lot of kind of signature Kehinde Wiley elements here, that we have this kind of densely patterned background. Barack Obama is sitting forward with his elbows on his thighs, and he's looking directly out at us. And embedded in all of this greenery around him are all these different flowers that are references to different parts of Barack Obama's life, like yellow chrysanthemums are a reference to his time in law school in Chicago and that sort of thing. And of course, Barack Obama is looking, really serious, very straightforward, but still, I would say, sort of kind. And apparently he said something to the effect of, thanks for not putting me on the back of a horse. I think he liked this more serious depiction. So the last artist we're going to look at is Titus Kaffar, and he's another MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner. And he is an artist that essentially taught himself to paint by going to art museums. And he became really fascinated with images like that George Washington that we started off with tonight. He looked at pictures like this, and he became focused on the Black figures that were there essentially to enhance the status of the white subjects, the Black figures that would have otherwise not been named, would have otherwise not have been researched or explored. So what he did, and he sort of, he does this expertly. And I should mention, he taught himself to paint, but he also went on to get an MFA from Yale. So he would repaint the original picture and then modify it to draw our attention to the Black figures that would have otherwise been overlooked. And so this is a picture that is called Shifting Gaze from 2017. He does something similar with this work of art, which is called Enough About You. I love this work. And the original picture is a painting of the founder of Yale University, where he went to graduate school. He repaints it, crumples it up, sort of makes it a sculpture in that way, and then adds a small frame around the face of the African child in this picture to draw our attention to the figures that have been previously overlooked and again, sort of unidentified. And we'll end with another kind of master work by Titus Kaffar, which is called Behind the Myth of Benevolence from 2014. And this is sort of bringing everything full circle. We started with one of our founding fathers. We're going to end with another founding father. This is Thomas Jefferson. And Titus Kaffar probably copied a portrait of Jefferson from 1800 by Rembrandt Peale. And again, he's loosened it from the canvas and made it sort of function like a curtain. He's made it very sculptural. And behind it, he just has us peek at a Black woman, a nude Black woman. And so this title, Behind the Myth of Benevolence, points to the fact that our founding fathers, many of them, most of them, owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson in particular had sexual relationships with his slaves, and sort of the truth and the reality of that. So to not gloss it over with just a simple portrait, but to reveal that hidden truth, which connects us back to that unusual painting that we sort of started off the 1800s with, the painting that was on the back of another picture, the sick little secret that that was shared amongst like-minded men and women. And Titus Kaffar essentially reveals it. He draws that curtain back and he shows it to us, and he makes us all confront it. So we'll wrap up on the hopeful note that we started with. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So we've seen, this whole long history, this kind of struggle towards progress. And I think what fills me with optimism and with hope is that some of these artists that we've finished with, Len Lygan, Titus Kaffar, they draw this line back to what has been, and they bring us forward and they push us even further along that arc to a place that is hopefully more just and equal. So I will end there for tonight, and I welcome any questions or comments anybody has about the material we looked at.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was a really, really powerful presentation.
Thank you.
It's really striking, the evolution of the art from the beginning of your presentation to the end. It's amazing. Did anybody have any questions? I invite you to send them to the chat, or to just, you can really just use the raise hand function if you'd like to, or if you'd like to just unmute yourself and ask it. Go ahead. I saw, what was the museum? The Phillips collection, when Jacob Lawrence passed through the Phillips collection in DC back when I was in college. It's a pretty amazing series, if anybody ever has a chance to see that one.
It's special when it all comes out and comes together.
Yeah.
Well, I know there was a lot of content as usual.
Yeah, there was.
And it's a lot to absorb. I think I think I've been surprised in my own life to see how many people are sort of blind to kind of the racism that's embedded in a lot of our visual history in America, and we've only just touched upon that because we were looking at works of fine art. You know, we weren't even looking at like the material culture of America. So I know that this is a lot to absorb, but I think again, those artists in that last section just do such really smart things to draw our attention to what has been, and to sort of prompt us to consider what could be. So that's maybe a good note to end on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Roz says, great presentation. I've never seen any of those paintings before, so thank you for bringing them to us. Amit says, thank you, great presentation and great tie-ins into history and historical events or older pieces of art. Amazing research on your part to put all of this together. And Catherine says, another excellent program, thank you. Linda says, exactly, very thought-provoking with images and artists I would never have seen except for Jane's great eye, so thank you. It's a really, truly valuable program to bring to us at this point. And I'm glad we recorded it, and I'm glad that we'll be able to share it with the wider audience after this.
My pleasure.
So thank you again, Jane, for a wonderful, wonderful time tonight. And thank you everyone for your patience and for joining us.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.